welcome back. Good morning, everyone. Happy Thursday. We're almost there to Friday. Good for you. That's exciting to get a little bit closer to the weekend. Those of you who are returning, welcome back. As Selena said, those of you who are starting with me this morning, welcome. Yesterday morning focused really on the facilitation of IEPs, and I talked about how IEPs are not just the product that you produce. It's not just the document, but it's also the process in terms of how you get there. And both the document and the process have compliance components that are tied with it. I think most notably having to do with meaningful participation by parents. You know, the more obviously you can involve them in the IEP process, the better. You're going to be on better footing. You're going to have a, more of a collaborative kind of atmosphere with parents. So I think, first and foremost, that is so important. And ultimately, in the end, what you're going to produce is an IEP that's going to meet the needs of the student. And that's really why we're here. Yesterday, we talked about putting the picture of the child in the center of the table, and people thought that was a great idea. And I wholeheartedly agree, because it really kind of takes us back, kind of makes us more child-centered, child-focused in the meeting, and really kind of takes away from what the adults in the room want, and really looks at what the child needs. And we did an activity yesterday where I had you just talk about what you did last weekend with a group of people, and but I said you couldn't use the word I. You found that very difficult, and we talked about the reason for that activity in the first place, and that was obviously to take the focus off of you as a facilitator, and instead really the people around the room, that you as a facilitator are the person who guides them unobtrusively and indirectly, like as a teacher often does in a classroom when children are learning and working on projects and so forth. You're going around and just monitoring kids in terms of how they're doing and whether or not they need support, things like that. So a facilitator is kind of the same thing. We then talked about the ideas of making an atmosphere that's really warming in terms of room arrangement, and having norms available for people so that they know what the expectations are, and having an agenda, and so that people understand really what the flow of the meeting is, and whether or not they have 2 hours, an hour and a half, an hour, whatever it is that you had set aside for them. Being able to at least give them an idea of a time frame allows them to kind of monitor their and budget their time. So we had conversations about that. We also then talked about kind of the 3 different areas of conflict. Sometimes we have conflict with people. Sometimes there's a conflict with the process that we use. And sometimes there's obviously the conflict in terms of the issue at hand or the problem. And so we talked about the different tools that we use in terms of setting the tone and listening, and just being cognizant of different personalities, and the fact that people come in with different positions and values and things like that. And also just in terms of the process, making sure that we need to, if we need to intervene, we do. Otherwise, maybe we are patient and let some things play out in a meeting that perhaps maybe is not so comfortable for everyone. And then we talked obviously about the problem and being able to get to the issues, and if needing to basically draw a meeting to a close and say we're kind of at a standstill, maybe we need to reschedule, or this is it kind of thing, and providing the parents with their procedural safeguards. Those were options as well. So those were some of the things that we kind of talked about yesterday morning. Yesterday afternoon, we got into the IEP, and we talked about the present levels of performance. We talked about goals, and we talked about progress toward goals. And we also talked about the sources that kind of govern the work that you do, and there are many of them, from the regulations and rules with IDEA and the New Mexico Administrative Code, to also case law that affects us. I mentioned the INDRF versus the Douglas School District in Denver, near Denver, Colorado. and also talked about the other kinds of entities like Office of Special Education Programs, Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services that really provide guidance, whether that's on how to address absences with students who are eligible or students who are being bullied, and what does that look like in terms of FAPE. So those were kind of the things that we had talked about with the sources that govern our work. In terms of the present levels and in terms of the progress toward goals and also goals, you had an opportunity to kind of, as a whole group, really look at a case study of Jamie Woods and be able to kind of pinpoint academic needs for her and functional needs for her. So, you were able to look at what her strengths were, what her areas of needs were, and then also look at, what would we target in terms of instruction. So I think you looked at reading for academics, and then I think it was like transitioning from class to class. I can't remember in terms of her functional skills, because she was moving from elementary to middle school, where obviously she's going to not have just one teacher, but multiple teachers. So those were some of the things that we had talked about yesterday. What we're going to get into this morning is more about the IEP, namely least restrictive environment and also prior written notice. We'll do that before lunch. After lunch, we're going to really kind of focus more on prior written notice. With the morning and the afternoon, we'll have an opportunity for you to participate in groups. So again, I thank you ahead of time for being able to work with individuals and really try to model for one another. And I appreciate people, speaking out. So, don't feel like you can't raise your hand and contribute. I know that sometimes that's a little bit scary. You might be a little bit hesitant to do so, but, people do benefit from what you have to say. So, all right. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and continue where we left off yesterday. This is a slide that I had that I introduced. It came from, as I mentioned, I believe the Public Education Department, and I think it's just a really good graphic of that whole IEP process. And what we talked about yesterday is really on the left side of your screen here, that this is the baseline information, if you will, that provides IEP teams with information about where to take the child from here. Really, it's just, getting that baseline data, that foundational information on what we know about the student, whether that's in the student profile, where we focus on, obviously, the area of strengths, because we want to know what strength areas the student has, what is he or she really good at, and build on that, right? But also the concerns or the needs, where are their deficits? And that tells us, what do we need to work on, basically. We also have, obviously, the family and the student's vision in terms of, what they see for themselves in the future, or what they see for their son or daughter in the future. And then also transition needs. We mentioned in New Mexico, I was talking about the sources that govern the work that we do, and how federally in IDEA, we have to look at transition needs of students no later than the IEP to be in effect when the child turns 16. But in New Mexico, it's 14, no later than 14. Obviously, we can do that sooner if needed. But we would look at, obviously, what their transition needs are. What are their post-secondary goals? What are their post-secondary needs in terms of attaining those goals? And then we looked at the educational performance. We talked about the academic areas of reading, writing, and math. What are those areas look like? We had an opportunity to look at different PLAFs, in fact, different present levels of academic achievement and functional performance, and compare, a non-comprehensive PLAF to a more comprehensive PLAF, and had a conversation about how, the more comprehensive it is, the more we understand what it is that we're going to need to work on, which then obviously leads to the goals. Okay. And then we talked about the impact of the exceptionality and on learning, or the impact of the disability, basically. And we had an opportunity to compare two different impact statements, where one was pretty vague. It really didn't give us much to go on. I think somebody said, well, this could have been written for any student, right? as opposed to Janie, where we use actual data from information that we're given. And then, of course, assessments and evaluation results. You had minimal information with Janie yesterday, but that's information that you would use in terms of how the student is doing in terms of assessments and things like that. So all of that we would be looking at in terms of other reports, what information the parent is contributing. A lot of times that information comes in terms of how the child's doing at home. What does it look like? And typically, homework, is a child understanding the homework? Do they struggle? Are they attending to tasks and so forth? So a lot of that information is very pertinent and gives us a really good foundation for what we know about the student. And so that left-hand side here really talks about all that it is encompassing that serves as the baseline for the goals. And then in terms of now looking forward, right, we then move to the heart of the IEP, really, and that is the goal section of the IEP. And for students who are on the alternate assessment, we're looking at benchmarks and or objectives. But in terms of goals, we really looked at kind of the 5 components of a goal in terms of time frame, conditions, behavior, criteria, and evaluation, and looked at comparing, again, kind of non-comprehensive goal to a more comprehensive goal. And certainly really understanding that the more comprehensive the goal is, the better it is for us to really note progress. And I mentioned Andrew F. yesterday and how there was an issue with progress being made with him. And that's really the key. Is what you've developed for the student producing results for the student. If what you developed in terms of the IEP is that actually are we seeing progress with the student? Because that's really the kicker, in my opinion. It's looking back and determining, is the student making appropriate progress? Okay, and then today we're going to focus kind of on the right hand side. And that's really kind of looking back at the goal, but it's all those kinds of things that need to be in place in order for them to meet the annual goal, okay? So it's everything from that package of services. We think of placement not as a location. It's not, as I said yesterday, Mrs. Soo Hoo's class, down the hall, room 13 at, Sunset Mesa Elementary School. That's not the placement. The placement is where on the continuum the student actually falls in terms of needing to implement all of this here, right? Okay, so in terms of placement, we think of the package of services, including the setting or the environment in which it's going to be delivered, okay? And with that, we have really services. We're not going to cover a lot of that today, maybe just kind of touch on services in and of itself, but we're talking about instruction in terms of special education and related services. We'll just briefly talk about that today, but also transition services, again, for those students for whom there are transition needs. But we also look at, obviously, the duration of those services, the nature of those services, and even special factors for students in terms of communication needs, behavioral needs, and things like that. And then in terms of the actual LRE, we're talking about where on the continuum, what's the LRE spot on the continuum that the student would be placed based on what those needs look like, okay? All right, and then of course we have any other types of supports that might be needed, other kinds of accommodations that might be necessary for that student to be successful. And then finally, as we're going to cover today, that prior written notice, it kind of, it shows it here as kind of like holding everything up. It really is kind of just a quick recap, if you will, of the decisions that were made in that IEP. So this is, I think, a really good graphic for us to look at when we cover each of those sections. Okay. All right, so I'm going to move on, and now we're going to talk about LRE and FAPE. I mentioned yesterday about FAPE, and I gave the definition of Andrew F, and we'll talk about it a little bit later, but If I were to think of a sentence that I could, recap IDEA into one sentence, in terms of the basic tenets of IDEA, I would probably say it's the FAPE and the LRE as defined by the IEP. That's really, if you were to encompass all of IDEA, it's really about FAPE, it's really about LRE, and it's really about the child's IEP. So IDEA mandates that we have to provide what's considered a FAPE. Obviously, all students get a free education. It's public and it's obviously an education, but what's so different in terms of special education is the A part of FAPE, the appropriate part. And that's, of course, that's going to look different for every single student. It's almost like your fingerprints. It's individualized, right? It's unique to you. And so you might have two kiddos who, let's say, have a specific learning disability in the area of reading. And yes, they both have difficulty with the coding. But those two students, even if they have the same type of eligibility category in the same area, are still so unique to one another. Yes, there may be some similarities, but there would be differences. And so when we look at FAPE, we have to individualize for that particular student. And that individualization comes with everything that we knew from that previous slide, that previous heart slide, everything from the left-hand side that we knew about that student, okay? And we also have to provide in the least restrictive environment. We'll define that in just a minute. That IEP is the tool really for documenting what it looks like. It's really the plan. It's really the plan that we put together to say, this is what the child's going to receive in order to receive a FAPE in the LRE. Okay. All right. It's also, by the way, looking at the standard set by obviously the court case in Andrew F. All right. When we look at the definition of FAPE, this is basically all it says in IDEA. And if as I said earlier, if you were to put that into your browser, you would pull up FAPE as part of IDEA. And the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 300 is that special education section, and FAPE happens to be number 17. FAPE is basically just defined as special education and related services. That's all it says, right? And so, I would also add all the other kinds of things, the supports that we know are necessary for that student in order to receive FAPE. And FAPE is something that is often judged in many different scenarios. It's not just whether or not student received FAPE through the IEP, but was a student denied FAPE when we didn't do an evaluation on time? Was a student denied FAPE when we didn't, provide, whether it's an initial evaluation or a supplemental evaluation or whatever? Oftentimes we are looked at in terms of whether or not the student was denied FAPE. So if you have a student who is in regular education for whom you suspected or there was a suspicion of a disability and we didn't evaluate that child in a timely manner, that child could conceivably have been denied a free appropriate public education, even when that student was in regular ed, if we suspected that the child was a child perhaps with a disability. So FAPE is something that is often looked at in many different scenarios. As I said, it doesn't just apply to the IEP. We can look at FAPE, whether or not student was denied FAPE, if we, let's say, suspend the student and we don't provide services, let's say starting on the 11th day and so forth. That could be a denial of FAPE and so forth. So FAPE is kind of all encompassing. It really is. We look at many different scenarios regarding that. So it's provided at no cost to the parent. It should be at obviously no cost to them. It has to meet the standards of the State Education Agency, the SEA. In this case, that's the New Mexico Public Education Department. And of course, it has to comport with the student's IEP. It's, whatever is written in the IEP is definitely what we implement. Okay. All right. So now let's talk about least restrictive environment. Least restrictive environment is something I think that is kind of challenging for a lot of people to understand. A lot of times you will hear people use the word inclusion. Inclusion is more of a philosophical view. It's not a term that's used in IDEA. The term that's used in IDEA is least restrictive environment. It means where on the continuum is the student placed? Is that in regular education with support as a push-in service? Or is that a combination of regular ed and special ed in a different setting and so forth? It's where on the continuum the child is placed based on his or her individual needs. You will not find the word inclusion in IDEA. You won't find it there. I've challenged people to that in the past, okay? Again, it's all about least restrictive environment. But if your way of thinking about it is inclusion, that's okay. That's okay. When you get to the LRA section of IDEA, of the IEP, excuse me, that's really what you're looking at is, you know, what does it look like for that student in terms of being with non-disabled peers, okay? So the definition in IDEA talks about to the maximum extent appropriate, not possible. Notice they say appropriate. A possible could be the kiddo is in regular ed. If school is 6.5 hours a day, 6.5 hours, right? But that might not be appropriate for that student. So to the maximum extent appropriate, students with disabilities are going to be with their non-disabled peers. And if not, in other words, if you need to remove them, it would be because of the nature or the severity of the disability. That being in a regular classroom, even with supplemental aids and services, there would not be progress for that student. Selena, is there a question?
Yes. How does this apply to a student that has to go through SAT, MLSS before being evaluated?
Oh, okay, okay. So we would not be considering least restrictive environment if that's what you're asking for a student at that point. We would be looking at least restrictive environment for a student who is obviously found eligible. And by eligible, I mean they've meet the 2 prongs. We didn't talk about the 2 prongs, but there's a 2-prong approach for students who have been evaluated. The first prong is that they have a presence of a disability. So they've gone through, let's say, they've gone through the evaluation process already. The MLSS, the response to intervention, has taken place. We've considered that information as well. And then we've determined that, yes, indeed, the student does have the presence of a disability, but the student also has to have a need for specially designed instruction or special education. So they have to meet not only the first prong of having a disability, but the second prong of needing special education and related services. For students who are going through that process of the evaluation, that, you know, obviously some students will go through MLSS and maybe not need to get evaluated. Maybe they're making appropriate progress for and really the key there is whether or not there's a suspicion of a disability. In terms of what kind of drives that, what kind of triggers that, what does that hinge on? It's whether or not there's a suspicion of the child having a disability. So children would go through the MLS RTI process, and maybe they would be in that process for quite some time, never get evaluated. Other students would maybe then move to an evaluation because now we suspect that there may be a disability there. But least restrictive environment would not be applicable for students in that regard. LRE would be applicable once a student is found eligible. We have to then determine what that package of services is going to look like. Did I answer the question for you, whoever raised it?
Yes.
Oh, super. Okay, good, good. All right. So in terms of removing a student, we really need to look at, again, the nature or the severity of the disability. Okay, and so not the eligibility category. Just because a student might have an intellectual disability, just because a student might have an emotional disturbance, just because a student might have autism, that in and of itself does not tell us whether or not a student needs to be removed from that regular education environment. What tells us is the nature and the severity of that disability, and the fact that supplemental aids and services in that regular education classroom is not going to produce the results that we want for that particular child. Okay. Now, I've heard this before, and let me see if I can kind of explain it to where it's clear to me and to you. I've heard people say we placed him in his LRE first. We placed him in the least restrictive. We placed him in the least restrictive environment first. Well, you would place him in the least restrictive environment first and last. That is your task. It's where on the continuum the student is needing to be placed. You may not. It may not be appropriate to first have him in, let's say, setting 1. For those of you who know settings 1, 2, 3, and 4, meaning the less intensive to most intensive. You don't need to basically try him or her out in setting 1. And if that's not appropriate, then we try setting 2. And if that's not appropriate, try setting 3, and so on. You're basically making that decision from the start. That child may need to go into setting 2 right away, or setting 3 right away. So when we talk about least restrictive environment, it's not, we know it's a continuum. It's not that you place the child on the left side of the continuum where there's less intensive services, because you know that's kind of a starting point. You place them on the continuum where you believe the child needs to be right from the start, first and last. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that, we got it wrong. Okay. The child needs less intensive services or more intensive services. That doesn't mean you can't move the child. But the idea is right from the start, you determine what that continuum looks like. Where on the continuum does the child need to be placed? Okay. I'm hoping I made that clear.
So here's the piece that we run into often, over the course of my career. I've experienced this many times. This idea of the staff does not have the abilities, the skills, or the training to be able to serve the student in a general education setting as being able to provide the aids or the accommodations and modifications.
Okay,
So
right.
we tend to have this, what it comes down to is more of abilities of people
Yeah,
as opposed to the abilities of the student.
right.
And over and over again, I don't know how many times I've heard it, and it's painful to hear, and it's really difficult to move this thought, which is we just don't have the staff. We just don't have the resources.
Yeah.
We're going to save the child from this particular classroom because this teacher is not going to match the student somehow.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so
I hear you.
it's a constant conversation, and it hasn't gotten any better. And this is, you're 24 for me, working with special education students.
Wow.
And so it's always like, oh, give them more PD, give them more PD. And with that thought, I haven't seen this dramatic improvement. What are your thoughts on this?
So, I hear what you're saying. A lot of schools are facing what you're facing in terms of lack of resources. That's so prevalent across the United States, and has been, especially since the pandemic, and now 5 years, really 4 after people came back to school. But in terms of the lack of resources, the courts are going to say, you know, it's still the responsibility of the school district to provide for the individual needs of the student. Now, that doesn't help, right? We know that, yes, we have to do that. What does that look like when you just don't have the people? Or what happens when you have the people and maybe they're not either skilled to, as you said, work with a student, or maybe they're not even accepting of working with a student, and then to the detriment of the student, we now are placing them in a more restrictive setting than what they really than what is really appropriate for them. The courts and IDEA would say, you know, to provide, Congress would say to provide, again, as you said, professional development, and the onus would be on you know, administration of the school to ensure that the staff is licensed and skilled and trained, and, you know, gets the resources that they need. That being said, I know you know, that we have issues of not being out there. You know, not being out there. Maybe you know, maybe the person is ready to receive it, but who's going to do the training? You know, maybe we don't even have people out there to do that. So you know, I know you're not going to like my answer, but the responsibility is on the school to make sure that the services and the supports are there for the student. One of the slides that you'll see, I'm going to put in there, I put in there professional development for staff. And that's one of the things that we would look at for having students in the regular education classroom, which is exactly what you're talking about, Cheryl. You know, providing that teacher with the skills and hopefully the acceptance of being able to you know, address the needs of the students in their classroom. So I know that's not an answer that maybe you know, gets you anywhere, but it would be basically the responsibility of the school district. So if the principal, I don't know if it's charter school or if you're in a small you know, school district or a large school district, but the principal would then be reaching out to, you know, their supervisor or other divisions, other departments, to try to get you know, people to come out and do training, and maybe not just training, but coaching. You know, not just train and then leave, but also train, coach, come back, you know, be there to provide support and ongoing kind of support and supervision for that person. So again, I know that's not the that's not the answer you're looking for, but that would be the expectation. That would truly be the expectation.
Sometimes we hear every child deserves the opportunity to be in that regular education classroom first. Even if, say, they're in our DD preschool program and we've had them for a couple of years, and the teachers, I feel like, have the data to show that that general education classroom may not be appropriate for that kid.
Right.
So
So that's along the lines of what Megan was asking, really. And that is, you know, you use the data to support the decision. And the decision is based on what is reasonably calculated for that child. If it's not reasonable to place a child in full-time regular ed or whatever, then it's not reasonable. You don't do it. Okay. You do look for opportunities, right? You're gonna assume the child, and we're going to talk about this in just a minute. You're going to start with regular ed. You're going to start with regular ed for every kiddo. You're going to analyze that data and determine, can that child be in regular ed, or does the child need to be removed from regular ed? And that's how you do that analysis. You start in regular ed as a mindset, just as a mindset. Start them there. But now then you're going to whittle away, if needed, the amount of time and the opportunities for that child to be in regular ed. So oftentimes, and I'm not knocking charter schools. I love charter schools, but a lot of times they don't have like full continuum of placements for students. And so oftentimes those the students who need more services would end up in a lesser restrictive setting than what they actually needed, because that's what the charter school had. That's what the charter school has available to them. Yet IDEA says that every LEA has to have a continuum of services. I know that's hard. That goes back to, oh gosh, who was I talking to earlier who had the question about resources? That goes back to resources. I get it. I get it. What the courts would say is, you know, sorry, however, you know, it's unfortunate. It's unfortunate because we're faced with that across the country. So if you have students that for whom your data indicates that they should be in a different kind of placement, that's where you start. That's where you start. Start off with regular ed, though. Think about regular ed. Can they be in you know, any of these particular classrooms? And if not, now you're gonna, you know, you're gonna go down the continuum. Does that help, Ida?
Yes. And
Okay.
then my second question is,
Yeah. Can you go a little bit louder? I'm having a hard time hearing you.
yes, so can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, so what if you have a kid that they just show up in kindergarten and it's obvious that they have a disability? Do you put them in regular kindergarten and put them through SAT? Through ML?
Yes. You do not place children in special education until you have determined the eligibility of a child. So
Correct.
you might need to fast track maybe that, you know, the RTI process, the MLSS for that student, because obviously that's a, you know, a pretty obvious indication of a pretty significant suspicion of a disability. So but you do not place them in special education. We had a school do that and we got in trouble, you know, for doing that. So just be mindful of that. You know, the special education services are for students for whom you've identified have met both prompts. They have the presence of a disability and they need special education and related services. So you might need to fast track that, you know, that MLSS process. And remember, you know, it's a simultaneous process. You do not, in fact, there's a guidance document on the website, and it came out from OSERS, the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, that says you can't deny a child an evaluation because they're to go finish the SAT process. So you would basically start that SAT process, and at the same time, you can start the evaluation process. It would be like a simultaneous track, okay? Like a, you know, two trains running down the track at the same time, so that you can get both, you know, get there a lot quicker. Does that help, Ida?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Okay, great questions, guys. Great questions. Okay.
Janine said the setting to start would be the LRE and then move to more intensive through the continuum until the right LRE is established, question mark?
So you would first and foremost pick wherever on the continuum of placements you believe the child needs. You may not be, that IEP team may not get it right. They may not get it right. And you may need to hold another IEP to move the child either lesser or more restrictive along that continuum. But you do, based on what you have, the information that you have at that time, you make your, I hate to call it best guess, but you do the best you can based on the information that you have. So it's reasonably calculated. It's reasonably calculated based on the information that you have at hand at that time. You determine where on the continuum the student needs to be placed. And that, you know, it's not set in stone. It's not set in stone. So you can, you know, come back to the table and maybe add more services, do more evaluations, whatever it may be, or maybe move that child along the continuum. But it's not based on trying out over here first, then trying this one, then trying this one. You try to get it right from the get-go. You try to, you know, pinpoint where on the continuum right from the start. Yeah.
It says, I will say as a teacher facing what happens when a preschool student leaves my room to go to kinder, it also falls back on the extreme difference from preschool room and expectations to what they have done to kindergarten and the crazy amount of rigor and expectations
Yeah.
that comes with kindergarten learning now.
Absolutely. Yeah. It seems like, the standards have definitely increased. So there's more, expectations being put upon, especially once you're in, the public school as a kindergartner on up. I think, it's just really important to know what that kindergarten curriculum looks like, no matter what level you teach, what grade level you teach. It's important to know what does it look like? If you're teaching, fourth graders, what does fifth grade expect from fourth graders? If you're teaching ninth graders, what does 10th grade, 10th grade teachers expect of 10th graders, and so on. It's just really, really important to have that vertical dialogue as well, just so what, how do you need to prepare that student? And when you're talking about really what is it going to look like in terms of pertinent goals, remember yesterday I talked about how it's important for the regular education teacher to be a part of that, because it's what are the expectations based on the curriculum that's being used, right? So what are we going to do to lessen that gap? Because you're using the standard. You're using the standard based on the grade level of that student. So the regular education teacher is so important in terms of, what's pertinent for this student. What do we want that child to know? Yes, there's lots of deficits. Yes, we could work on a multitude of goals for this student. But what would be pertinent? What would be the most notable for this child in order to be successful in a regular education setting, if appropriate? Okay.
Janine said, what if they can be in the mainstream class, but there are 3 to 4 level behind GLE? Should they be placed in a sheltered environment? What would be best?
That depends. Okay, so that's hard for me to answer because I don't know the student, don't know the circumstances, but what you would need to look at, and we're going to go over it in just a minute, are what are some of the supports that might be necessary for that child in the classroom. Right here in the terms of this definition, it says, based on the nature or the severity of the disability, it's such that education in the regular classroom with the use of supplemental aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. You're going to have to assess if the use of supplemental aids and services would be able to provide this particular child with success in that regular classroom. So that's why the regular education teacher is so important. And somebody had said, it's always the special education teachers that go to trainings and not the regular education teachers. That is so true. And I wish it, that we would have a lot of regular education teachers attend as well. But that's why it's so important for the regular education teacher to be involved in that IEP and really talk about what does it look like in his or her classroom? What could the use of supplemental aids and services be? What could those look like in order for the child to be successful? And we're going to talk about what those look like in a minute, okay? So LRE is just, I think it's kind of like explaining discipline in special education. It's just a huge convoluted kind of concept. So is least restrictive environment. A lot of times people think you have to go down the continuum, start at the top and work your way down. But instead, we pinpoint where on that continuum that child needs to be first and foremost. Okay, and that's based on the nature and the severity of the child's disability, and that's based on us in terms of reasonableness. We as professionals, what do we know about autism? What do we know about this student with autism? What do we know about teaching and learning with curriculum of students with autism? What do we know about the regular education teacher in, let's say, third grade? And what kinds of things we could put in that regular education classroom in terms of supports. So those are the kinds of things that you have to have a conversation about. And that's going to vary it's going to be individualized with every single student. Okay. Hopefully I was able to kind of get that a little bit more clear, but I know it's a really tough subject. This is just a court case that's often quoted. Came out of the Fourth Circuit back in, oh my gosh, now 21 years ago. But it basically talks about what a placement is. It's really a package of services. It's not the brick and mortar schoolhouse. So it's really kind of, again, where on the continuum does a child need to be based on the supports and services the child needs, based on the goals the child needs to work on. So it's just reiterating the fact that it is a service and not a place. It's not Mrs. Soo Hoo's third grade classroom down the hall in room 13 at Sunset View Elementary School. It's really the package of services and where on the continuum the student needs to be. So the IEP team determines the placement of the student. The LEA would determine the location. Let me give you an example of that. So somebody mentioned blind and visually impaired as an eligibility yesterday. I forgot what the conversation was, but in our school district, it might have been Cheryl, in our school district, we had a program available in an elementary school, a program available in a middle school, and a program available in a high school for children who were blind and needed to be taught through Braille and other kinds of intensive support. And so we then would determine, the LEA would determine where those services would be. But the IEP team would determine the placement of the student. The student would need that type of classroom, that type of setting. And then the LEA says, oh, well, we have that over at this middle school and so on. Okay, so placement is different than location. So when we talk about looking at that analysis, as I said, you start with regular education first. The student is funded regular education first. You look at your mindset is the student is in regular ed, and now we look to see if the child needs to be removed during the course of the day. Does the child need maybe a combination of the two, between regular education and a combination of special education? But before you do that, think about the supports that might be necessary, those supplemental aids and services. It might be that that the child might need some curricular kinds of supports or certain types of materials to be successful in the classroom. They might need modifications, let's say, to the curriculum. Maybe other students are working on something completely different, but this child is in there getting maybe the social skills, that exposure to language and behavior and to subject matter and so on. You might need an itinerant special education provider. That was the request of Amy Rowley. When I talked about Amy Rowley earlier, Amy's parents said, we want an interpreter to go in and instruct Amy as well. You might need assistance from a paraprofessional. Somebody said an IA yesterday. I think that probably is an instructional assistant or an educational assistant. Maybe an EA goes into that regular education class. Here's where somebody was talking about it earlier today about specialized training for the teachers and paraprofessionals. Do they need training on a particular curriculum, on a particular program, whether it's, crisis prevention intervention, whether it's a use of some kind of assistive technology device or whatever? If that's what is going to make that child successful in that regular education setting, then that's what we provide. I know, I think it was Cheryl or whomever it was talking about obviously the challenges with that, but that would be basically examples of support. I just mentioned assistive technology. Does that child need an augmentative communication device in that regular education classroom? Because they can understand that content and participate with non-disabled peers, but that's what's going to assist them and make them successful in that regular classroom. How about universal design for learning, UDL principles and materials and so forth? Having that's available to all students, and hopefully you and your teams have had trainings on UDL, but it's a way to really kind of change I guess, trying to think of a good way to explain it, kind of level the playing field, if you will, almost similar to what I would consider accommodations when it comes to UDL, because it's providing additional supports through technology and other kinds of means for students to be able to continue to learn the content, but maybe with a different reading level or something like that, okay? Or does that child need a BIP, an FBA BIP? if that's what it's going to take for them to be successful in the regular education classroom. Obviously, this list is not exhaustive. So there are many other kinds of things that might be necessary in order for that child to be successful in that regular education setting. But think about that. Think about those kinds of things, those supplemental aids and services. Would anything like this or something else that we can provide for the student make that child be successful in that regular education setting? You're doing that as an analysis right from the start. And your answer may be no. Your answer may be no. So now we might need to look at a combination of regular ed and special ed. Maybe they're in there for all subject matter, but math is a difficult area. And we go, the child is maybe pulled out for math. Or maybe a classroom teacher comes in. Maybe there's co-teaching. Maybe, it just depends on, obviously, what that individual child needs. But we start with regular education first. We then look to see, does that child then need to be removed from that regular education setting in order to receive that instruction? Because the use of supplemental aids and services would not be successful for that student. Okay. All right. So I also want you to think about the areas to consider when you're making that determination. You're looking at the strengths of the student. Obviously, what is the child really good at, right? Why not be in that regular education classroom for that, right? If we have incredible strength areas, right? What about the goal areas and the appropriate setting for implementing the goals? An often example I use has to do with, let's say, articulation. Is it appropriate for the goal to be addressed in a regular education classroom if a child is needing to work with a speech and language pathologist, let's say? Okay. And you've got the noise that, I'm not saying chaos in a bad way, but you've got just a lot of distractions in a regular education classroom. Does it make sense now for that child to be pulled out to work with a speech and language pathologist, to work on implementing a goal having to do with articulation? Or is it appropriate for the SLP to go in? It just depends. You're going to have to make that determination. So you want to look at that class schedule. Again, this is where that particular regular education teacher's involvement in the IEP is so critical. It's so critical because you're going to look at the kind of the schedule. How do they run their classroom? What does a typical day look like in 5th grade or in 8th grade or whatever it may be? Look for those opportunities to implement the goal. There might be actually a combination of, I mentioned yesterday, let's say a student might have difficulty in the area of math in terms of mathematical reasoning, but they're really good with computation. And maybe the teacher does like Mad Minute or whatever, at the beginning, does a lot of, exercises with computation. So little Susie stays in there during that time. And then when it's time to do, word problems and problem solving and so forth, maybe, a teacher comes in and helps, or maybe Susie goes to a different classroom, like a resource room or something. So think along those lines. There could be a combination of as well. Okay. Again, what's going to tailor it to meet the individual needs of that particular student? I get it that you may not have those resources. I get it. But our charge is to develop IEPs that are reasonably calculated, right? And that's really where we go with that. And, there might need to be conversations with administration. There might need to be, administration might need to have conversations with other people, maybe at the district level or whatever it may be. But obviously, we first and foremost write that IEP to meet the unique needs of the student. Okay. Again, that doesn't help when you don't have the people. All right. Here are some considerations of what you might look at in terms of removing a student from regular education. The first one is just a portion of what that standard is within NDRO-F. That's a standard by which you develop an IEP. That's the standard in which all IEPs are going to be judged, okay? And that is the placement for that student doesn't allow for appropriate progress, really, okay? So that's why you pinpoint on the continuum right from the start, okay? You look at the placement that is going to allow that child appropriate progress, okay? Another consideration is if the child has intensive needs for being instructed, and that outweighs the opportunity to interact with the typically developing peers. Oftentimes, usually the younger the students are, we kind of really look at social skills, and allowing that student. I know there's studies for students who have intellectual disabilities that show that students, especially the young students, really get a lot of benefit from being with their typically developing peers. They learn a lot of appropriate language, they learn appropriate behaviors, they learn school behaviors, things like that. But sometimes as the years go on and as the curriculum becomes more rigorous, we now may need to look at something different for that child, because now the need for those services might outweigh the benefits the child's going to get from being with the typically developing peers. Another consideration might be if you have to modify the curriculum so much that really it's not the same curriculum anymore. You have to consider, is it appropriate for Susie to be in, 3rd grade while everybody's doing expository writing and Susie's working on spelling words over by herself? Is that appropriate? Or does it make sense for Susie to be, in a different kind of setting? Yes, Susie's there with non-disabled peers, but what does that look like? Is that appropriate? Or is there more of an isolation for Susie? So think about those kinds of things. Other things to consider is if the behavior of the student interferes with the learning of other students. And that's not, the student who gets up and sharpens the pencil or, 500 times and, or is distracted or whatever, it's unless obviously that is not appropriate for that particular child, meaning they're just not benefiting from that regular education setting. We also have to look at a safety risk. We talk about the idea of making sure that campuses are safe. When I do the trainings on discipline and special ed, we talk about dangerousness and we talk about, campus safety and so forth and how important that is. And so if a student's presence in that classroom is a safety risk to either him or herself or other students, that again would be a consideration. What happens if it takes a lot of the teachers, that person takes a lot of the teacher's time, kind of to the detriment of the other students? It's not to say that there are 25 students in the class and every student gets 1/25 of the teacher's time. That's not how it works. Some students need more time from the teacher. Other students are a lot more, able to, be on their own, and so are not needing additional support from the teacher. But if it's so much of the teacher's time, perhaps then that child needs to be removed, okay? We can talk about cost and we can consider cost, but it can't be the basis for that decision. It's not the deciding factor. If a child needs a particular program and there's not any other alternatives, then the district is responsible for that. It's kind of like our Braille books. Some of those can cost $50,000, $60,000, right? And so if that's what the child needs and there's no other alternative that's appropriate, then we have to provide that for the student, okay? All right, so in terms of LRE requirements, we know it's based on the IEP, okay? It's based on what we, everything that leads up to, to the goals, right? Through the goals. It's everything we know about the student in terms of what their strengths are, what their needs are. It's everything we know in terms of what it is that we have to work on for that student and what would be the appropriate settings in order to address that goal. We would do that annually, of course. That's at every single annual IEP. We always look at LRE. And again, it's based on the impact of the student, the nature and the severity of that child's disability, okay? All right, when we talk about LRE, we look at, now this is for more of school districts, but we look at where the child would be in terms of as close to the child's neighborhood school as possible. Okay, so in our school district, we have the advantage of having lots of schools, and so not every school is required to have every single program available to students, but the LEA, the district, the local education agency, is responsible for having it somewhere within the district. And so we would obviously place a child as close to that child's neighborhood school as possible based on the needs of that individual student. So we might have multiple programs, and we pick the closest school, obviously, that has that particular program to where that child would be if he or she had gone to a neighborhood school. So basically it's saying it's the school that the child would attend normally, or some other arrangement, obviously, if the child weren't disabled. And then we also want to consider potential harmful effects of placement itself. Kind of give you an idea of that. There was a student whose IEP was done, with only about 3 or 4 weeks remaining of the school year. And it was determined that the student needed a more intensive kind of setting that really wasn't at that particular neighborhood school. Rather than moving the student at that time, they just thought that's going to be, harmful to this student. That's not going to be, good for him to leave his school with just 3 weeks to go. Why not, continue, with the supports and services that we have, and then have him start at the beginning of next school year. So, it was a decision that the IEP team made because they thought that would be harmful to the kiddo. They have to, leave, almost at the end of the year. Why not leave when every other student finishes out the school year, because it was just a short time remaining, and then start up at a new school. So it seemed like, they weren't coming into a new school having to learn, make new friends and learn new expectations and all of that with just a few weeks remaining. So those are some of the things that you can think about as well. LRE does apply to things outside the classroom. So it first and foremost really applies to transportation. It's not asking the parent if they want special transportation. It's really determining, does the child need special transportation? Now, some of you are at charter schools or whatever, and obviously schools of choice and so forth. But if you're at a school, in a school district where students have, are going to, one of multiple schools, we need to look to see whether or not, can the student get to school, in terms of like any other student, or take a bus, the regular bus like any other student, or do they need actual special transportation in order to access the services, okay? It also applies to non-academic activities, so, or classes and so forth. So non-academic would be like your music, art, PE, things like that. Non-academic, not reading, writing, and math. And then finally, I know there's a question. Finally, it also applies to extracurricular. This is something that is very difficult to do. But we're talking band, we're talking, marching band before and after school. We're talking, maybe dances and things like that. If there is specific supports that are necessary for that particular child, we have to do that. So I know the extracurricular part kind of makes it even more difficult for a lot of school districts. So you make the placement decisions. You make the placement decisions based on obviously the information that you have at your disposal, leading all the way up to the LRE section of the IEP. That's why you don't come in with a predetermined idea of where the child's going to be in terms of placement. You might, I shouldn't say you don't come in with that idea. You can come in with that idea, but you need to have an open mind. We're not predetermining, oh my gosh, Susie's not going to be successful in the regular classroom. We're going to need to put her in resource room for reading and math, or we're going to need to put her in a self-contained class. You might have that in mind. When you come in, you have that conversation around the table. You talk about her present levels, her strengths, her needs. You talk about the goals that she's going to need to work on. You talk about the supports that are necessary for that goal, and what kinds of things could happen in that regular education classroom in order for Susie to be successful. Okay, that looks like that's not going to be successful. So now we make that decision, and it may validate what I originally had in mind, or it may not. It may not compute with what I originally decided, what I originally was thinking. But no decision is made until we look at all the information that we have at our disposal. everything about that student, everything I went over in terms of the left side and the middle and the right side of that slide, in terms of what we know about the child, especially in terms of present levels, especially in terms of the goals and in what kind of setting it would be appropriate to implement those goals, and what kinds of supports are necessary, whether they're accommodations and modifications, whether they're other kinds of services for the student, whether it's a related service and so forth, okay? So we don't make that decision until then, okay? So it's obviously based on the areas of need, and it's really how do those areas, what does it look like in terms of impact, in terms of the general education curriculum? Because that's really what you're looking at in present levels, right? You're looking at the individual needs of the student. You're looking at how that student's disability impacts their ability to be in the regular education setting and have access to the general education curriculum, okay? So here's an example of LRE, and I would see this a lot, okay? And I'm going to just, something that I would see a lot in auditing IEPs. And I think your opinion of this is going to be similar to what you said yesterday to some of the other examples. But somebody wrote basically, obviously this M is fictitious, but due to Emma's disabilities in the area of academics and communication, she requires a small group setting to address her needs. Just input real quick, anybody who would just want to kind of give an opinion as to what that looks like. I know you know that I give you the kind of the less comprehensive example before I give you more, but
Well,
yeah.
part of the confusion with this could be it doesn't say if it's small group for academics or for communication.
Okay, good point. So we're not saying whether or not it's a small group for academics or a small group for communication. Good point. Anybody else?
What does this small group look like? Is it a set number of kids? Is it a set number of days? Is it a set time?
Yeah.
Does she need it all day? Does she need it just for one area of academics, like Jennifer was saying, or is it just one area of communication?
Absolutely. And something I would question is, can you do a small group setting in a regular classroom? Can you move kids to a small group and work with
Yes,
them?
you can.
Yeah, absolutely, right? So she needs a small group setting. Okay, she's in regular ed. Let's just move her to the side along with maybe other students or maybe one-on-one, and we'll work with her. That doesn't tell me really what the setting looks like, right? It doesn't tell me the placement of that particular student. And you're right, it doesn't identify between academics and communication. We know she has deficits in both areas, but what does it look like for either one? Okay. How about let's compare it to this? Just because there's obviously more words doesn't necessarily make it a little bit more comprehensive, but I think you would agree on this one. It says exclusive instruction in the general education setting would not meet Emma's needs, as her academic and communication skills require a higher level of support in a setting that would allow her to make progress at her own pace and skill level. She requires the use of multisensory research-based curriculum, which is not available in this setting. Special instruction for her communication needs require a setting that provides a quiet environment that allows her to focus. The general education setting is too distracting and does not focus on specific skills necessary for her to make expected progress. So here we've got obviously a statement that gives us the difference between what a regular education setting would look like and some other kind of setting, right? It basically lets us know that the regular education setting, the general education setting, is not going to support her based on, the level of support that she needs, she needs specially designed instruction. She has a need for a multisensory research-based curriculum to help with the academics. We need also a quiet setting that allows her to focus. General education setting is not going to provide that. So, when we look back at the two, I would see this a lot. I do see this a lot, but it doesn't give us any information about Emma. This one does. Emma's, needs can be met more in a segregated setting, in another type of setting.
I guess
Go
I just
ahead.
have a question
Yeah.
around that one. To me, this is sounding more and more like she needs specific SOP services, not necessarily academic resources.
Okay.
And the
Could be.
academic resources will benefit off of that, but it's not specifically modifying her academic instruction.
Say that last part again.
It doesn't seem like this is actually modifying her academic instruction. It's not really modifying the curriculum. It's not really modifying the general education setting. This is just saying, in order to facilitate her
Oh,
communication skills and things like that, she'll benefit from having a segregated set of
absolutely, that she needs
part-time.
to be in a separate setting. Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, and if she needs to have the curriculum modified, absolutely, that's fine too. That can be done in a regular education setting. That could be in consultation with the, between the regular education teacher and the special education teacher. And the regular education teacher delivers the instruction. It could be just through consultation, right? And I don't mean just consultation services. I mean regular education teacher, special education teacher working together to modify the curriculum. And then that happens in the regular education setting. That could be a combination of the regular education teacher, special education teacher in that regular education setting. That could be the removal of Emma to a special education classroom to where the regular education teacher or SLP or whomever could be providing instruction for that student. I mean, there's obviously a multitude of combinations that can be used for, that can be utilized for Emma. Basically, this is kind of just saying that, her LRE is really not in full-time regular education setting.
I appreciate that. LRE is a little confusing sometimes.
It is. It's so confusing. It's clear as mud oftentimes, It's just, just think of a linear point on a continuum that, where you start out. Next time, you know what I'll do? I'll do a slide that kind of depicts that. But, let's say on the left-hand side, you have regular ed, and you have the push-in services, and then you're going along those lines in terms of a combination of regular ed, special ed, and then you're going even more intensive to where there's more special ed, and with each point on the line that you're moving from left to right, you're getting less and less regular ed exposure. And you're getting more and more special ed exposure. So you're kind of looking at where on that point can that student be? And it might be, a combination of, right? The student might do really well with somebody coming in and providing support for language arts, but they need a pullout, let's say, for math. It's not a be all end all. You look at it on an individual basis. And hello, Janie, just as a quick reminder of her, remember she's moving from elementary to middle. She has autism, lots of difficulty with learning language and communicating with others. She needs a lot of repetition. She does really well when it's hands-on. She does imitate behaviors of others, which can be good or bad, because obviously if we've got some maybe inappropriate models, she's going to model that as well. Okay. She had been in a full inclusion class in her previous district. Okay. Parents obviously want that for her when she goes off to middle school. The IEP team, that doesn't necessarily, you may not agree with this. This is where we'll have a conversation. But the IEP team determined that she really needed to be in more of a segregated class when she reaches middle school, that they wanted her in really more of a kind of a social communications class because of the lack of communication, because of the behavior and things like that. Okay. She has, based on reports from the special ed teacher, that she does really well working at a table, but it really can't be more than 4 students at a time. Again, great with the hands-on activity. She does really well when there's structure and there's predictability, which we know a lot of times children with autism need that predictability. Very limited skills in communication, so she has difficulty expressing her wants and needs. Okay, and that's obviously a very, very important. And that she does need behavior supports when she becomes frustrated. Okay. And then the regular education teacher, she comes with an aide, again, commenting how she likes hands-on activity. She likes, subjects like library and art. So your non-academic areas, right? And that these children had been receptive to her. That's fantastic. again, saying that she has difficulty communicating her wants and needs, will oftentimes pull away from an activity when she becomes frustrated. And she also has difficulty kind of going through centers. You know, she has a hard time going through the learning centers, and the staff need to redirect her often. Okay. At that time, you know, obviously she's going off to middle school, so she's 6th grade. She looks like she's about anywhere from 2 to 3 grade levels below of where she would be if she were not likely a child with a disability. Okay, so what do you think you would do? What as an IEP team? I know this is very little information. You don't have a lot of what you would normally have in front of you. Okay, but what might you consider in terms of LRE for her going off to middle school? What could it look like? Remember, we start with regular ed first. We look at those supplemental aids and services. You know, does she need an FBA VIP? Maybe so. Does she need you know, a paraprofessional going in? Maybe so. Does the classroom teacher need training and professional development? Maybe so, and so on. Okay, so what are some of the things that you might consider? Rachel?
I would start with including her in things that she likes, like the science class with an
Okay,
aid.
yeah.
I would include her in library. I would include her in art and set apart a chunk of her day, maybe 1 or 2 periods where she has more downtime, a smaller
Mhm.
classroom, and,
Okay.
and more specialized instruction to kind of close that gap since it's 2 to 3 grade levels below,
Yeah.
but give her that chance to interact. And I know it's hard because science is so specialized in middle school
Correct.
with that vocabulary, with that
Mhm.
more in-depth specialized level of vocab, but give her that chance in an academic setting to flex her muscles and be included, because science can be fun and it
Uh-huh.
can be breached. It's not dry. It's not, I have to sit down and write sentences. It's not, I have to think about the math of it.
Yeah, good point. I mean, it definitely is obvious in here that she really likes science. She likes hands-on activities. You know, just talking with that regular education teacher, right? What does science look like? How do you run a science, you know, classroom? Are they doing labs? Are they, you know, and you know, perhaps maybe we do some UDL. There's a program called Snap and Read under UDL that will basically lower the content level, the reading level for a student, but you know, still teach the same kind of content. So there might be opportunities there. Good point. Starting with what she excels in, what she really likes to do.
You
Okay,
could
anybody else?
also pair her with a peer
Okay.
in those classes, like for notes and things like that.
Okay.
Because sometimes if you have a student who's advanced in science and understands all of the lessons, they
Uh-huh.
can put it on a level that their peers understand better. And that
Oh,
might,
yeah. Okay. Okay. And maybe even pairing with a peer when they are doing experiments or whatever, right? I mean, that you end up with that kind of relationship between the two.
yeah.
to
And
where-
instead of it being an adult aid, then you
Mhm.
have, it's just a peer, which
Yeah.
will help her with her communication as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. You know, sometimes, and I think Mr. Woods here expresses that, you know, that you come to rely on the educational assistant, and educational assistants are just phenomenal. But sometimes they might, you know, not know when to back off, when to let the student become more independent. You know, there's this, you know, I think maybe struggle as to, you know, when the child could be on their own and so forth. And so, you know, I think you're right in terms of, you know, having students kind of learn language from each other, right? And just, and also you're making a social connection, right? You're making a, you know, it's an opportunity for you to be with your typically developing peers, and you know, and maybe you know, you're out in passing period together, maybe you're at lunch together at the same table or whatever, or you know, I mean, there's going to maybe be a bond formed here, to where the students are going to be involved in more social activities and so forth. So good point. Good point. Anybody else? Any other opinions?
Rachel put in the chat I would be careful with pairing a peer so that the peer doesn't feel like they are being punished. Not
Oh,
saying it could go that way. Sometimes kiddos just don't understand why they get stuck with kids who
oh, yeah.
don't get it.
Yeah, absolutely. I get the, the flip side of that. For sure, the peer is not the instructor, so we do have to be careful with that. We're not relying on a peer to be an instructor. But you do pair up kids in your class. You do, you say let's work in pairs, let's work in a small group or whatever. And the expectation is to have cooperative learning, to learn from each other, to have a team approach. But you're right, Rachel, you do have to be careful. Somebody's going to have to intervene if let's say the peer is having difficulty or feels responsible or is experiencing maybe behaviors or feeling as though they have to instruct the child, that the pressure is on them, that the responsibility is on them. We never want a child to feel as if they're put upon, right? They're really there as a peer. They're there as a peer, and like you all are learning together, right? Just these are peers. You all are peers, right? Having conversations and kind of learning from one another. That's what you're trying to instill in a classroom. But you're right, Rachel. You don't want it to reach the point where the child is going to be felt put upon. Maybe you change up the identify kind of different groups. Maybe for the first unit it's one peer, and for another unit it's another peer, and so forth. And so you kind of change up how you divide the students to work together. So, but that's a good point. I mean, you definitely don't want the students to feel put upon. So good observation on the flip side. Okay, anybody else?
Juliana stated, agreed, maybe finding a high school tutor that is interested in going into education. We have a lot of students like that
Yeah.
go to middle school and work with students.
Love it. Love it. I think that's great. It gives the high schooler the opportunity to learn to work with students, obviously with special needs, and then it benefits the students at the middle school level. I love that your district is doing that. I just think that it's it's a great relationship between the two. I appreciate that. All right, this I think is the last time you're going to see this slide. Aren't you happy? Okay. All right. I'm not going to go back and just kind of talk about the different aspects that kind of lead up to the end of the IEP, but really take this to heart. No pun intended. Take this to heart in terms of all the things that you kind of need to consider when determining the services for a student, the placement of where that child's going to receive those services. Okay. So the last area we're going to talk about before you have lunch today is the prior written notice. And that is, kind of what is holding up that IEP. It kind of, serves as the be all end all, as I would say. It's called prior written notice, even though you kind of write it. Many people write it at the end of the meeting. I'll give some tips for maybe writing it as you go along during the meeting, and we'll talk about that in just a bit. But typically, it's written at the end. It's or at least reviewed at the end. It's called prior written notice. Prior, even though it's kind of at the end of the meeting, because it's basically all the proposals and things that we're going to do or not do prior to either doing or not doing something. Okay, so it's kind of giving parents prior notice, for lack of another term, but prior, kind of a heads up. Here, mom, here, dad. This is what we say we're going to do. This is what we say we're not going to do prior to it happening, or it was to have happened. Okay, so that's why we call it prior. The prior written notice really is, I think, the part of the IEP that one of my colleagues used to say that, if you had you know, mom and dad, and mom was the only one at the IEP. If mom took the IEP home to dad and he read the prior written notice, he would kind of get a really good idea as to what, you know, what took place during the meeting. Because it really takes, you know, kind of captures the conversations, the kind of the heavy duty conversations that took place in the meeting. And then of course, the decisions that were made based on those conversations and really the justification of why. So oftentimes when I would audit IEPs at different schools, different school districts, different charter schools and so forth, this is where I started. I started with a prior written notice. It just kind of gave me a foundation for what I was going to find or what I should have found in the IEP. Okay. So it, you know, the fact that it's, it kind of captures all of that just kind of tells me, oh, I should find, you know, conversations about this particular topic that's listed in the prior written notice somewhere in the IEP. Okay. All right. So when we talk about a prior written notice, this comes out of the Code of Federal Regulations. If you put this in your browser, this is what you're going to see in terms of a prior written notice. This is something that has now changed, and I'm going to share with you in just a minute. When it comes to the local level, having to do with the term reasonable time. Okay, but let me just kind of give you this and then I'll show you what I'm talking about. So basically, it's a written notice given to a parent, a reasonable time. IDEA doesn't say what reasonable time is, doesn't say that it's 2 weeks, 30 days, you know, 6 months, whatever. It just says a reasonable time before it, the district, proposes or refuses. Proposes, agrees to, or refuses, does not agree to, either initiate or change the identification of a child, evaluation of a child, educational placement of a child, or provision of FAPE to the child. So basically, almost anything we do, I mentioned earlier today that you know, FAPE kind of runs the gamut across the board. Just about everything we do, we have to determine, you know, did we deny that child FAPE? It's the same thing really with a prior written notice. There are so many examples of when we have to provide a prior written notice to a parent. Okay, this is actually I pulled my compliance corner article for March. It'll be coming up next month. I'm doing 1 of 4, 2 of 4, 3 of 4, and 4 of 4 having to do with a prior written notice. So this is going to be in the next prior written notice that you'll see on the website that Selena shared with you yesterday, and I make sure that I give her time today to share with you as well. But basically, what I did was kind of break it down in terms of, well, what does identification mean? What does evaluation mean? What does educational placement mean? And what does the provision of FAPE mean to, you know, in which we have to give those circumstances in which we have to give prior written notice. So when we agree to do something or refuse to do something having to do with any one of these 4, we have to give the parent prior written notice. Basically, it's, you know, it's giving them information, their rights. It's kind of a contract, basically, of saying this is what we are going to do, what we're not going to do. So when we talk about the identification of a student, that's really kind of the eligibility determination conversations that we have when we, you know, determine whether or not a child is eligible for under IDEA. And I mentioned earlier today, didn't talk about it yesterday, but talked about the 2-pronged approach when we talk about eligibility. The child has to have the presence of a disability, one of the identified eligibility categories under IDEA, and also NMT, because developmental disability is also an added eligibility category. So one or more of those eligibility categories and needs special education and related services. So in some cases, you might have a student who has the presence of a disability, but doesn't need special education and related services. Let me give you an example. I just want to kind of throw this out there to kind of give you an idea of what I'm talking about. We had a student years and years and years ago who was made eligible by the EDT, by the eligibility determination team. This child had muscular dystrophy. But in looking at at all of the information the child had available to them, it didn't appear as though he really needed special education and related services. And what they came to that conclusion when they couldn't figure out a goal or goals for the student, because everything showed that he was, just spot on. And what he really needed was, because of the medical condition, he needed a little bit of extra time for, just getting assignments done. And so, we looked at it and thought, well, wait a minute, is extra time really special education, right? Is it really, something that a special education teacher would need to provide, or is it something that the regular education teacher would provide? And they later went back and said, you know what, this is something that the regular education teacher can provide in the regular classroom, because they didn't need to change what he was learning. They didn't need to modify the content, the delivery, or the methodology of instruction. He just needed extra time. And so really he just kind of needed an accommodation. So he met that first prong. He had another health impairment, but he didn't meet the second prong. He didn't have the need for special education and related services. So that's what we need mean in terms of identification, when we identify whether or not a student is eligible under IDEA. And we do that from an initial evaluation, right? Do they have the presence of a disability, and do they need special education and related services? We also do that through a reevaluation. Does the child continue to need special education? And does the child continue to have a presence of a disability and need special education and related services? Or do we need to change the eligibility category, right? We need to change the identification of that student, or we need to maybe add, other eligibility categories, or perhaps we need to discontinue altogether through that reevaluation. So that's kind of what we need in terms of identification. Another example of that, those of you who do preschool, transitioning in from Part C to Part B. I mentioned Part C yesterday. That's the birth to 3 through age 2, where children are receiving services with their family through early intervention agencies, right? And so when children transition from that part of IDEA to Part B of what we do for ages 3 through 21, then we're looking at the identification of a student, again, determining whether or not the student has the eligibility requirements under IDEA. When we look at evaluation, obviously that's the assessments that we're going to do, whether it's an initial referral, whether it's a reevaluation, whether it's an independent educational evaluation that maybe a school district has agreed to from a parent. Maybe it's even a parent provided evaluation that we're going to consider, or maybe it's even a functional behavioral assessment that we do. Okay, those are just examples of evaluation. So when we're going to evaluate a child, when we have proposed to or refused to, we have to give a prior written notice. Okay, so we do that on identification in terms of eligibility category, whether or not the child's eligible. We do that on evaluations as well. Okay, we have to do that in terms of educational placement. Where on that continuum, right? We were talking about LRE earlier. Where on that continuum is that child going to be? That's part of prior written notice. We have to give prior written notice to tell the parent, this is what we're considering, or this is what we've decided, really. And again, as I said, the state IEP forms might already say setting 1, setting 2, setting 3, setting 4 in terms of what you're considering, okay? And then when it comes to discipline, those of you who attended any of the discipline trainings that I've done, when you suspend a child or expel a child, it would likely result in a change in educational placement for the child. So that would be another example of when we'd give a prior written notice to a parent, okay? And then finally, the provision of FAPE to the child. And that's really kind of through the IEP in terms of the initial provision of special education and related services, any kind of changes to it, if we're going to, add extra time, take away time, add, a different area whether it's, OT, PT, social work, SLP services, et cetera. Obviously, those would be changes. Any type of, when there's a revocation of services, parents have the right to revoke services. They can say, I don't want my child in special education anymore. If they do that, we have to give them prior written notice. We have to basically spell out what it is that the child is no longer going to be afforded, okay, including protections for discipline. We have to inform the parent, kind of like, this is what your child will no longer be afforded, okay, or privy to, or no longer provided for your child. Also, the program of study, the option to the diploma, and there are some changes that are coming out regarding that. I think Juan Portley is he is one of the consultants that does trainings having to do with transition services. So he focuses on the 14 to age 22 services for kids, and what the options to the diploma would look like, and what those post-secondary opportunities might be. Just letting you know, I know they're working on some changes having to do with options to the diploma in terms of the ability pathway and also the modified pathway. So just kind of be, ready to kind of receive new information that probably will come on shortly. But the program of study is something that we would list in the prior written notice. It's talking about the different options that we considered. If we didn't, if we didn't select a standard option to the diploma, then, why did we choose the modified? Or if we didn't choose the option or modified, why did we select the ability and so forth? So that's something that obviously would constitute provision of faith. Graduation itself is really a change in placement. It's a change in educational placement for the child. And when the child moves on, we have to provide prior written notice to a parent. And then finally, really, I think the transfer of rights, and that's something that the Public Education Department expects us to make sure that we inform parents. And in the state of New Mexico, the transfer of rights happens at age 18, unless, of course, there are provisions, unless there are issues with guardianship and so forth. But at age 18, we need to start really, as we are talking about transition needs of students back in, when they are 14, to talk about the transfer of rights. Okay, so those are just some of the things that we would put, some examples of what it would mean in terms of identifying a child, evaluating a child, the educational placement of a child, or the provision of FAPE to the child. Okay, that list is not exhaustive. You would be putting in lots of other things as well. Okay, that, in other words, you would be doing a prior written notice for other kinds of situations as well. It would behoove you to give a prior written notice rather than not give one, right? Maybe you don't need to give one, but I think that's probably better than if you don't give one. Okay, sometimes more is more. So anyway, all right, Selena, we have a question.
We have several questions. Do you want me to save them until you have a stopping point?
Yeah,
or...
let's do a stopping point. So say that since if they're all about prior written notice.
Okay, yeah, I'm pretty sure most of them are.
Let's do it before we go to lunch. So let me kind of get through this, and since they're all about prior written notice, which is what we're talking about, we'll do it before we go to lunch. Okay. Awesome.
Okay, sounds good.
Thank you for saving that. Okay, so here we have IDEA talking about us having to provide a prior written notice to a parent a reasonable time before we either propose or refuse to do any one or more of these separate categories. Okay. However, the New Mexico Public Education Department worked with obviously some concerns, basically responded to some concerns having to do with that term reasonable time, because IDEA doesn't define it. The New Mexico Administrative Code now does when it comes to a parent requesting an evaluation. Okay, in IDEA, let me get my little mouse here. In IDEA, an evaluation can take no longer than 60 calendar days, 60 calendar days. That has stayed the same with New Mexico. New Mexico did not make that more stringent. They didn't say 45, they didn't say 30, okay? Obviously, they can't go less. They can certainly demand more, okay? So the 60 calendar days stayed the same. Also, what stayed the same is the time in which we have to basically write that IEP following an eligibility determination team meeting. You remember yesterday I went over that. I said 30 calendar days. You usually do it back to back, but if you don't, you have 30 calendar days to write the IEP, okay? That did not change with the state. What did change with the state was when a parent makes a request for an evaluation. IDEA says a reasonable time before we either refuse or propose to evaluate the child, right? That's one of the categories. The state has now defined reasonable. So now we follow what the state has said, because again, they can go above and beyond and demand more of us. What they now say is we have to, within 15 school days, respond to the parent when a parent is requesting an evaluation, or when we, the district, are requesting to evaluate a student, okay? We have 15 school days to respond. And there's some caveats there. The caveats have to do with, if we're up against a break, then, there could be 30 days from the date of referral and so forth. There are some exceptions and you'll see that, okay? So they defined reasonable for us. They also put in some other kinds of timelines that are not in IDEA as well. And that is, once the evaluation is completed, we have 15 school days to do that EDT. Obviously, there's some caveats there, okay? And you'll see at the bottom, basically, if we're up against a break, then they give us 15 school days, okay, after the students return to school. They also give us another date that says we have to provide the parent with their the child's diagnostic report at least 2 days, 2 days before we hold the EDT, okay? So this right here is new as of last year, I think July 1st, 2023, now almost 2 years, July 1st of 2023. This is new, and this is new, okay? So here's an example where, again, IDEA didn't define it for us, but now the New Mexico Administrative Code does, okay? All right, so just so you know, what we have to do for a parent having to do with prior written notice is if the parent requests an evaluation, or if the district says, I suspect Susie has a disability, and we tell the parent we want to evaluate, we do that within 15 school days. We provide for the parent a prior written notice. We also provide the procedural safeguards. Remember, those are the parent-child rights that we provide to parents, in many, many situations. And then we also either obtain consent if we agree to do an evaluation, or if we are asking to evaluate and the parent agrees, we obtain consent. Or we don't obtain consent, obviously, if we're refusing to evaluate, or if the parent refuses to let us evaluate. Okay, so at a minimum, within the 15 school days of a parent requesting an evaluation, or we are requesting evaluation, within 15 school days, we provide a prior written notice to a parent. We provide their procedural safeguards. And if the evaluation is going to move forward, we have to seek consent. Okay, so I just wanted to share that with you because I think it's, it's obviously something different than what's in IDEA. It's what's required now of all school districts within New Mexico as of July 1st of 2023. Okay, all right. So moving on, in terms of a prior written notice, we also look at basically what has to be in it. Okay, and I want to kind of take number 3 individually, just because that's an area where I think a lot of prior written notices are lacking. And we'll give you some examples. I'll give you some examples of what that could look like. But basically, that left-hand side is, you know, having to do with, you know, what you propose or refuse to do. Okay, in terms of the identification, evaluation, educational placement, or provision of FAPE to the child. That's kind of that left-hand side. The right-hand side of that prior written notice is the description. Sorry, the left-hand side is the description of the action that the public agency is proposing. The right-hand side is an explanation of why we are accepting or why we're refusing to do something. Okay, so left-hand side is saying this is what we want to do, or this is what is being proposed. The right-hand side is saying this is why we're not going to do it or why we are going to do it. Okay, and it's going to be based on data. We talked about yesterday how W. Edward Deming said, without data, you're just another person with an opinion, right? Data is important, okay? You want to base that on any one or more of these 4 things that are listed. An evaluation procedure that was done, an assessment that was done. I'll give you examples in just a bit. Any type of records you might have on the student, or any type of reports you might have on the student. You're basing the decision on one or more of these 4 things as applicable, whatever's applicable in that situation, okay? And we'll talk about that in just a minute. So those are the required contents of an IEP. There are more. These 4, 5, 6, and 7 are usually embedded in your IEP document. They're usually part of, you know, the template, if you will. And it's basically telling the parents that they have protections, they have procedural safeguards, and that, you know, how to basically get a copy of those protections and so forth. It also has typically a fill-in for you to write in who are they going to contact if they need assistance in understanding aspects of their child's IEP, aspects of special ed, and so forth. And that's why I said it's really important yesterday to know the procedural safeguards booklet that you hand out, you know, the little pamphlet that you give out, okay? Number 6 and 7, I think really 7 is kind of a catch-all, but and 6 could be too. It just says any other kinds of options that the IEP team considered. So it's kind of just catching lots of different things. Okay, so those are the required contents of the IEP. Like I said, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are usually embedded in your IEP template. You may fill in, you know, who to contact. Here's the person's number and so forth. But 1, 2, and 3 are really kind of the crux of what you put on the left-hand side and what you put on the right-hand side of the prior written notice page. Okay. All right. So what does that look like then? In terms of a prior written notice, you it really is kind of you know, again, taking the decisions that have been made by the IEP team and just kind of putting them down on a page that just says you know, what we accepted to do, what we rejected, basically. And hopefully the parents leave that you know, that IEP meeting understanding the decisions because they were kind of clearly documented. I mean, hopefully they were based on data. Hopefully they were based on data. Okay. All right. So here, this list is not exhaustive by any means. Okay. There may be other things that your school district requires you to put in. One school district requires them to put in the actual course of study in the prior written notice. I'm not sure if the state's going to end up doing that, but basically, you know, they list the courses that a student would take, you know, in terms of their for meeting post-secondary opportunities and so forth. So again, this is not exhaustive by any means, but basically you're going to put in the services, right? You're going to put in what the child's going to receive, you know, however many minutes of you know, of language arts instruction and special ed, you know, per week, how many hours of speech service and language services per week and so forth. You're kind of, you know, you're putting in the service itself, you're putting in the amount of time, you're putting in the setting. And that's what I was just talking about in terms of LRE. That's the placement, another word for placement, the package of services really in terms of the services and the setting, okay? That would be determined, that would be what you would determine in terms of what the child needs, would receive and where would they receive it, okay, and what type of setting. Graduation options, as you consider, you know, if it's not the standard diploma, you know, then a modified. If it's not the modified, then maybe ability, and why you rejected the ones above. As I said, there will be some changes to that. And then, of course, all proposals made by the parents. You have, you know, as much as you can capture into the IEP, the better. You know, we had one parent who filed against us and said that they did not have meaningful participation. 300.322 of IDEA talks about meaningful participation. Our IEP was riddled with conversations with the parent, information the parent was contributing and including in the prior written notice. So obviously there was no standing there. You know, it was just because there was a disagreement as to the decisions were made, that didn't mean that we didn't have meaningful participation. It just meant, you know, and it was obviously indicated throughout the IEP. So again, all proposals made by the parents, you want to make sure that you have that, okay? So how many parties actually come to an IEP? There's really only two. It's really, you might have a lot of people around the table, but it's really only two parties. It's really the LEA or the district and the parent, okay? And so, you know, the parent has the right to bring whomever to the table. We have the right to bring whomever at the table. We need to, you know, have conversations with parents so that they know who to expect, right? As part of that, what's also considered a prior written notice of the meeting. We indicate, you know, basically, and as I talked yesterday about it, we indicate kind of who's going to be there in terms of regular education teacher, transition specialist, or whomever. So again, however, there would still be two parties at an IEP, okay? The LEA and the parent, okay? All right, so who makes proposals? Proposals can come from the district or the LEA or the parent, right? The district makes proposals, the parent makes proposals, but those proposals are only accepted or rejected by the district, by the LEA. Remember, ultimately, it's the district's responsibility to develop an IEP that's reasonably calculated in order for the child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. The Andrew F. standard for FAPE. We are responsible for FAPE, okay? The reasons for acceptance or rejection must be documented, and it needs to be based on number 3, evaluation procedure, assessment, record, and or report, any one of those that are applicable in that situation. So the reason for rejection would be documented. You want to specify if your template doesn't have that, who's making the proposal? Is it coming from the parent or is it coming from the district? Is it coming from the parent or is it coming from the local education agency? Okay. A lot of I know our last template, our last IEP program, we actually had to put in there parent proposes or parent is asking for whatever. Where our previous one, you just checked a box. It was either parent or district, okay? All right, so how to document. You wanna make sure that the documentation is complete and it's accurate, okay? The reason for rejecting is essential. Again, base it on those decisions. You wanna base it on those decisions, and we're gonna break those down in just a minute in terms of evaluation procedure, assessment, record, or report, okay? You want to review and analyze the data to make decisions. We talked yesterday when we talked about facilitating IEP and how important it is to kind of take the emotional part out of it. And somebody had said that data does do that. That's true. That's true. When you let the data do the talking, then, I mean, they could question obviously the data, but when you have the data do the talking, the data is the one that is giving us the reason for accepting or rejecting, then you're on better footing than you are if it just it sounds like an opinion, okay? All right, so how do you individualize? Yeah, obviously the justification for those decisions are based on what we know about the student, okay? I mentioned that every child doesn't need the same supports, even if they have the same eligibility category, even if they have the same area of need. Every child is different. So again, you're basing that information on what we have in front of us in terms of present levels, student profile, what areas they need to work on, what are the supports that are necessary, what kind of setting would it be appropriate in order to administer those goals. Okay. We have to make sure that we focus on the child and not what the adults at the table want. We talk about parental preference and we talk about administrative convenience. Parental preference is something that obviously parents come to the table asking for their child, and we just want to take a look at what does the parent see as that addressing, or we need to kind of question that parent in terms of what it is that they are seeking, without obviously putting them on the spot and so forth. But sometimes they hear about something and they think, oh, this might be what my child needs, and so you would consider every single proposal from the parent, but we don't do it based on the parental preference. We do it based on what the child needs. Okay. We did talk yesterday about perhaps kind of negotiating, kind of compromising, as long as it's not harmful to the student, as long as you're not denying FAPE to the student, maybe that's something you go ahead and agree to. But again, make sure that is an analysis that you do as to whether or not that's something needed. We also talk about administrative convenience, and this is where it gets really hard. This is where the conversation happened earlier this morning about, well, what if we don't have the personnel, right? What if we don't have, what if we have people who, they get trained and then nothing changes, or maybe they, have, a lack of interest, or, just not wanting to work with kids with special needs in their classroom or whatever. Sometimes we place children in a particular setting, or provide certain services and supports and so forth because of what we call administrative convenience. That means when you don't have the resources available, when you then you are basically working around that and placing a child likely not in their least restrictive environment and not receiving FAPE because of other factors. And so I get that many of you are faced with that because you just don't have the personnel, you don't have the the trainings available and so forth. But we just have to be mindful of, again, our charge is to develop an IEP that's going to be reasonably calculated for that child. Okay. And then, as I mentioned earlier, and we had that slide on there, we always consider regular education setting first. You start there and you whittle away as needed. Okay. And think about it in terms of the child being in special ed, and does the child need to be, the child's in regular ed, and does the child need to be in special ed, as opposed to when can the child be in regular ed and start with special ed. We always start with regular ed first. So it's kind of like starting on that left side of that continuum, right? And then working your way to the right with more intensive services and supports and less regular education as needed for that particular child. Okay. All right. In terms of documenting parent proposals, I'm going to give you some examples this afternoon and kind of just give you an idea as how some school districts got into trouble. But it really, parents don't typically come and say, I propose XYZ for my child. They might say it in many different ways, and I'll give you some examples of that. So, when it's less obvious or it's less explicit, take the time to ask the parents, to explain a little bit further what exactly they're wanting. You want to obviously, just as I mentioned, in terms of administrative convenience, really focus on what the child needs rather than what you have available. You know, I get it that the resources aren't there, but we have an obligation to develop that IEP for that student. And then, of course, we talked about clarification, and that was something yesterday when we were going through kind of facilitating an IEP. You know, ask clarifying questions of that parent in order to gain an understanding of what it is that they're actually wanting. Okay, and other people around the table as well. Okay, so again, be mindful of what you think a parent is trying to say. Clarify it with that parent, maybe rephrase, you know, if I'm hearing you correctly, this is what you're asking for. Is that what you're saying? And then obviously you go from there. Okay. All right. In terms of helpful hints, you, as I said, may not have this luxury, but when you have a complex IEP, if you can get somebody else in there to help you, I think that is going to be so beneficial for you. Especially when it comes to the prior written notice page. It is so hard to do both. And again, you may not have that ability, but it's so hard to facilitate a meeting, be the scribe and get everything in the document. And at the same time, listen for all these other kinds of things that need to be captured in the prior written notice. And so if you have a chance to do that, I would do that, okay? If you reject a proposal from a parent, perhaps propose another way to kind of address what their concerns are. I think I gave an example yesterday of a parent, a parent who, when the student was going from elementary to middle school, like Janie Woods, the parent all of a sudden asked for an educational assistant and, you know, threw the IEP team off, like, because it was just kind of out of nowhere, and there really had been no indication of her son needing support in that regard, in that intensive manner. And when they just, you know, probe the parent, you know, what are your concerns regarding middle school and so forth? I mentioned that she was concerned that he would get lost, but he wouldn't know, you know, what was, you know, his next class and how to get there and so forth. And so, you know, they rejected the parent proposal for an educational assistant and said why they rejected it. But then they found another way to address the parent's concern. And that was they assigned someone at the middle school level who would just monitor the student for the first 2 weeks and make sure that he got to his classes. He knew where he was supposed to go and he got there on time. And that was it. But what they ended up doing was, instead of just saying no, move on, they found a way to really address the parent's underlying concern. And that's really, you know, what you were trying to do, right? You're trying to address that concern. Something I didn't mention yesterday was sometimes parents, you know, just want to be heard, you know, and so obviously, you know, the parent was concerned here, thought that, you know, an EA would be appropriate. District said, wow, you know, that's pretty intensive, right? But let's do this instead. And so obviously the parent is being heard. Her concern was being addressed based on, you know, obviously this example, okay? When you have contentious meetings, something I would recommend you do is that you review each of those proposals each time the decision is made. I mentioned yesterday, I might have mentioned that sometimes when you wait till the end to kind of review the prior written notice, it might dredge up a lot of the emotions that have happened during the course of the IEP. So maybe, you know, just as the decisions are being made, you review that proposal and then, you know, go on to the next topic and then review that proposal, that decision and so forth. And so just a helpful hint, just from experience. You always want to document on the IEP, the services and the supports prior to determining the setting. And that's because that's the flow of an IEP, right? You don't determine placement until we've already talked about what the services and supports are going to look like for that student. And then something our IEP specialists would do is they would kind of put together sentence starters. I think somebody mentioned something about that yesterday. So that's okay. You know, when I shared with you, I think it was page 109 of the Developing Quality IEPs book, it had for you examples of goals. You know, it had the conditions, it had the behavior, it had the time frame, it had the criteria and the evaluation. That's just kind of a bank of ideas to draw upon. It would be the same thing here. You can do sentence starters, but please make them specific. You know, when you do the reason for that, make it specific to that particular student. Okay. Make it based on evaluation, procedure, assessment, record, or report, so that it's not just, as someone said, applicable to any student. Okay. All right. Okay, we're almost done, and then we'll share some time for questions. So let me give you a couple of examples. This afternoon, when you come back from lunch, we're going to focus specifically on prior written notices and how to recognize maybe less explicit kinds of proposals from parents. But here's an example of a parent asking for a full-time EA. Okay, so on the left-hand side of the prior written notice page, you might say parent proposes full-time EA, you know, for Susie, whatever, okay, or propose full-time EA. The decision would be rejected by the IEP team. So, you know, you might have an accept or reject, depending on what type of IEP program you use or whatever. And then on the right-hand side, it says Susie's making progress with her current level of services, and a full-time EA is not necessary. So as you know, I usually give the first one that leaves a lot to be desired. Who would like to just kind of give their opinion as to what they think about this particular proposal? Anyone? What do you think? I know you're getting tired. It's close to lunch.
I'll jump in.
Okay.
I see what the parent's saying, a full-time EA for Susie in the IEP. It sounds pretty blunt. It sounds very
Okay.
black and white.
Okay.
I get the justification that she's making progress with her current level of services, and a full-time EA is not necessary. Okay, but is there still parts of the day that she struggles with? Is there still parts of the day that she would benefit from having that? And I understand that the reasoning is, of course, everyone would benefit from one-on-one. Everyone would
Yes.
benefit from having more supports. Everyone would benefit from that. But if it's equitable for her to be able to reach those academic achievements
Mm.
and to have academic success, that's something that we need to look at. Like you're saying, looking outside the black and white boxes
Mhm.
and saying, okay, she really needs support going from that last period before lunch, going into lunch, and coming back out of
Mhm.
lunch.
Right, right. Absolutely. So you're right. I love the fact that you said everybody would benefit from extra support. Absolutely. The question is whether or not they need it, right? Benefit from is different from do they need it? But in this case, obviously, but there's not really an idea as to, well, it says full-time, so we would assume it'd be like, you know, for every class and maybe passing period and lunch or whatever the case may be. You know, we kind of would make that assumption from a parent, and you know, I certainly would want to have the conversation at the table as to, you know, tell me more about that. You know, what kinds of situations do you think, and what type of situations do you think she would need that support and so forth. But by saying in terms of the justification, she's making progress and she doesn't need it, we really don't have the data to back it up, right? We don't have the reason why. It almost sounds like an opinion. Well, she's making progress. She really doesn't need it. To me, it kind of just blows off the parent, and which is obviously something we don't want to do. And just kind of, in my opinion, it's giving an opinion. So yes, you're right. You know, children would benefit. Everybody would benefit from it. But maybe it's even more harmful, right? Okay. Such as in this next example. So the next example says, so it's still rejected by, it's the same proposal. It's still the same decision rejected by the IEP team, but this time it says that the general education teacher, special education teacher, and related service providers report that she's steadily gaining independence regarding task completion, as evidenced by her daily tracking and observational sheets. Based on the daily tracking and observational sheets, she's increasing her independence by 25% each quarter. The committee feels that increasing support from a paraprofessional would increase a sense of dependency and decrease her independence. And so this one obviously is a lot more beefed up. It gives basically data. It gives, it's not an evaluation, it's not an assessment, but it would be likely a record that we are keeping on her. Remember, we talked about an evaluation, assessment, record, or report. It could even be reports in terms of what the general education teacher is saying, the special education teacher is saying, the related service providers are saying. So we're using those as the basis for the decision for rejecting the parents. I mean, if we look at this one, the parent would say, well, in what way? In what way is she making progress? Here it's telling us, every quarter she's increasing her independency. She's turning in, completion, things by 25%. So at least it's based on data. And it doesn't look as though, just kind of out of thin air made a proposal. So you're right. Yeah, go ahead.
I will say as a parent, if I was feeling spicy or like my child wasn't being heard or I wasn't being heard on the first example, I would drive that farther with the district, with the state, with everybody, because I would have more foundation for it.
Absolutely.
The second one, I
Absolutely.
would feel better about it as a parent because I could actually see where they're saying and explaining it, why. And then I could also go back on to it. So when she goes on to a different teacher or a different school and they try to, do the first example to me again, look,
Right.
here's the data. This is what it's
Absolutely.
saying.
Here's the data. That's great. And you're going to get that in the progress toward goals section of the IEP as well, or at least you should, right? If this is a goal area, which it likely is, in the progress toward goals, you're not going to just say she's making progress and give it a, depending on the IEP program you're using, and give it a 2, or whatever. You're going to basically provide data. She's made progress since the last quarter and increasing her independence by 25%, as evidenced by, and, give examples and so forth. So good point there, obviously. Very good. Very good. All right. We are almost at time. I just want to kind of give you an idea as to just some resources that you can, refer to if you have an opportunity to do that. Your district might have a few of these particular publications. I really love LRP. They put out really good resources that are written by attorneys, and everything from, predetermining an LRE to discipline to IEPs to special ed law. I mean, you name it, they've written about it. Autism. Anyway, I just wanted to share that with you. Okay. And then, okay.
Because it said, wouldn't he qualify under other health impaired for academic monitoring?
Good question. Good question. Okay, let's think about the word monitoring. When we talk about special education is defined under 300.34 as changes to the content, the delivery, or the methodology of instruction. So again, 300.39. Changes to the content, the delivery, or the methodology of instruction. When you think about monitoring a student, is that changing the content of what the student is expected to learn? Is it changing the methodology by how the child is supposed to learn? Is it changing the delivery of instruction by how the child is to learn? It's just basically somebody kind of overseeing how a student is doing. And in my opinion, that's not special education. You might, in this regard, and what we would always do is send the students kind of back to SAT to be monitored. And that's what happened in this case. When the student was found not eligible because they didn't meet that second prong, they did not need special education and related services, which monitoring doesn't meet the definition of that. The student was then continued to be monitored by SAT. Okay, they continued. Now, at some point down the road, this child might need special education and related services. Maybe the condition of this student might be such that that it now affects more of this particular child. But when you think about monitoring, that's not even the level 1 or level A of services, because the services have to do with either, again, the delivery of the changing in the content, the delivery of methodology of instruction, and then the level at which you do that, at the level in which you do that. So level A or setting 1 would be minimal changes to the content, delivery, or methodology instruction versus level 4 or level D, where it's extensive changes to the content, delivery, or methodology instruction. So in this case, what would the special education teacher do that a regular education teacher would not be able to do? What's so special about the intervening for the student that it would involve a special education teacher? So that's how I try to explain the difference when people say monitoring, because monitoring is not special education. Yeah, we monitor kids, right? And that just means we, observe them. But if it's just overseeing how they're doing, a check-in here and there, that's not special education. That would be something that we would continue to oversee and monitor through SAT, through making sure that the student is still responding appropriately to response to intervention, or MLSS. Something came to mind during lunch. I was thinking of the term wait to fail, wait to fail. And if you remember correctly, the slide I shared with you, remember the definition under IDEA says that you have to provide a prior written notice to a parent a reasonable time before you either propose or refuse to do something having to do with identification, evaluation, educational placement, or provision of services, provision of faith to a child. That effort that was done and became effective on July 1st, 2023, also entailed a change in the evaluation process for children. For children who were in grades K through 3, we usually would, when determining whether or not a student might have a specific learning disability, implement what's called the dual discrepancy model. And that dual discrepancy model would look at areas of strengths and weaknesses for the child. And then grades 4 through 12, the school districts had the option of using what was called a severe discrepancy model. And that was looking at the difference between where a child is expected to be performing and where the child is performing. And, that gap had to be significant enough to determine the child to, help determine the child to be eligible. Well, the public education department sent out information about how there are now changes to how we evaluate children who are suspected of having a disability. And that is for all students, regardless of the grade level, not regardless of K through 3 or 4 through 12, the dual discrepancy model has to be utilized and not the severe discrepancy model. And the reason they decided not to use the severe discrepancy model is because they felt as though it was a wait to fail. You had to wait until there was a significant gap between where the child should be performing and where the child is performing for that to say, oh yeah, they meet testing criteria. So I started thinking about that in terms of least restrictive environment. And people had asked about, well, you've kind of been told that you have to start with regular education first. I see that, obviously, we look at pinpointing where on the continuum, the LRE continuum, that child needs to be placed first and foremost. But if you think about it, it would be a wait to fail model with that kind of thinking. If we said, well, we have to try them in regular ed first. If we do that, and that's not successful, we wait to fail. That child has to wait to fail to then be moved to an appropriate placement on that continuum. So I just started to kind of think and compare the two. I thought, actually that would be a wait to fail for that particular student, because we would have to demonstrate that the child couldn't handle it before we then move the child to another setting. So hopefully that kind of helps drive that home as well. I just was thinking about that. Okay. This afternoon, we're going to finish the 2-day presentation. And as I said, I'm going to focus a lot on the prior written notice. There are going to be some examples of some things I'm going to share with you of what parents might say. Remember, we talked about being able to recognize obvious and less explicit, less obvious, less explicit kinds of requests that parents might have for us. And so we'll have a chance to do that. You are going to be participating in groups this afternoon. So I'm not sure how many there are of you, but Selena will get you into breakout rooms. I'm going to kind of give you assignments for each of those breakout rooms. So there'll be something specific that you'll need to do, and each group will vary. And then we'll have a chance to come back and report on that. So again, I thank you in advance for being able to, or being willing and able to participate with one another. And as I said, I just am a big believer in trying to, vary this with activities that help drive it home, but also give you the opportunities to learn from one another. So we will take a break about halfway through. And I will make sure, like I did yesterday, to give Selena time to do what she needs to do to go over the website before you leave. I think it's really important that you do stick around for that if you haven't been a part of that before, because there's a plethora of information on the website. It's currently kind of under construction. So if you wouldn't mind being patient with that, we would appreciate it. But lots of information, lots of trainings that you have the opportunity to peruse at your leisure. So do stay around for that. Okay. All right. I am calling this, did you just say that? So in terms of recognizing less obvious, less explicit kinds of dialogue that might come from parents, I thought this might be an appropriate title. The lack of communication or miscommunication often leads to misunderstandings or to hurt feelings and things like that. I do a 6-part series for would-be administrators or new administrators. And the very first one I always do is on communication, because they spend so much time talking with parents, as you all do in classrooms or in whatever role you're doing. Communication is extremely important. And so oftentimes, there could be just some hurt feelings, or just maybe some actions that come about when somebody is not heard, or if there is some kind of miscommunication. And so, you want to stave off, obviously, those complaints and requests for due process hearings. But more importantly, again, it's the child at hand that we are really focused on. And so That's what we just need to keep front and center. Okay. All right. So I'm going to just kind of take a few minutes to review some salient points of what I hope to have gotten across to you in the last now day and a half, and give you an opportunity to kind of work with others on specific areas as well. But I think when first and foremost, it's really important that we go back and review the Andrew F. standard. This is the standard by which your IEPs should be developed. This is the standard by which your IEPs will be judged. So again, you are doing what you can do based on the information that you have regarding the student to write that IEP that you believe is going to produce results for this child. Okay, so to kind of take you back a little bit, I mentioned yesterday, I compared the two different standards that we had up until 2017. I mentioned when we started with special education law, special education rule regulations, and so forth, in 1975, that was the Education for All Handicapped Children's Act. That later morphed into what we now know as the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And we know that it's been reauthorized a few times, but hasn't been reauthorized since 2004. So the regulations that are on the books are the regulations that have been in place for about 21 years. In 1982, the parents of Amy Rowley decided to challenge their claim that their daughter Amy was being denied a free, appropriate public education. They felt as though their child's services were not providing appropriate public education for her. Okay. Amy, if you remember, I think was in kindergarten at that time and was moving on to first grade. Amy was a little girl who was deaf, now an adult who is deaf, but at the time was doing very well in school. Amy was cognitively intact. She was able to gather a lot of the content that was being taught in the classroom. The school was using basically like FM trainers to amplify the teacher's voice, and et cetera. Amy wasn't getting everything that was being said in the classroom, but she was bright enough, obviously, to piece things together and still do quite well. The school had even tried with the use of an interpreter. They thought, well, let's try an interpreter out for her. They determined that it wasn't necessary, that she didn't need it. She did not need that level of support, that what she was currently getting was providing her with a free, appropriate public education. Obviously, the parents disagreed because this was a case that got all the way up to the Supreme Court. And so for the first time, the Supreme Court, the high court in the land, ended up hearing the case regarding FAPE and whether or not a child was denied that. And what came about was the agreement, really, that Amy's IEP was, in fact, reasonably calculated in order for her to receive educational benefit. And that's just basically what it said, educational benefit. No description of what that means, but basically the IEP has to comply with procedural directives, okay, comply with those, and be reasonably calculated, okay, so that means you dot your I's, cross your T's, you follow what IDEA says you have to do in terms of timelines, things like that. And you develop an IEP that's reasonably calculated. That means people who are sitting around the table, including the parent, who know the child, who know about children who are deaf, who know about teaching children who are deaf, etc., are going to reasonably calculate and develop the IEP for this student in order for this child to receive educational benefit. That became the standard for all school districts across this nation from 1982 to 2017. In 2017, we were introduced to a new standard, a new case challenging the standard that had been in place for 35 years. And that involved a little boy by the name of Andrew, who was up in Colorado. And by the way, kind of our same circuit. If we think about we're in the 10th circuit. New Mexico is one of 6 states. Wyoming, Utah, Colorado, New Mexico, Kansas, Oklahoma are all within the 10th circuit. So whatever happens in the 10th circuit, any one of those other 5 states impacts us. Okay. It's definitely, it binds us to those decisions. Okay. So if it had stopped there, it would have impacted us and really the 5 states. But it didn't just stop there. The parents ended up taking it all the way to the Supreme Court again. The Supreme Court took a look at that and said, whoa, stop the presses here. Andrew and Amy present so differently. Amy was able to grasp a lot of the concepts. She really wasn't impacted so severely by her disability that it affected her education. But Andrew was. Andrew was a little boy with autism, and he was severely impacted by his autism. The parents alleged that the IEP looked the same from year to year to year, and Andrew was making what we would call de minimis or minimal progress. In the 10th circuit, that is considered appropriate amount of progress. De minimis is appropriate based on what the 10th circuit looked at in terms of students progressing. The Supreme Court disagreed and said he needed to make more progress basically than what he was making. The parents had pulled him out and put him in a private school, then asked the school district to reimburse them for the private school tuition. While at this private school, he flourished. He did really well. They ended up writing an FBA and a BIP for him, which apparently hadn't been done within the school district. And so he started to make really good progress. And so a new standard came out, and they kept part of that standard from Amy, but made a change to that second half. They said you have to comply with all procedure requirements. That was the same as Amy. But instead of saying developing an IEP that's reasonably calculated in order to receive educational benefit, they said you have to develop an IEP that's reasonably calculated that would allow the child to make progress appropriate in light of the child's circumstances. Speaking of special education, the next one, Selena, gosh, thank you. Okay, the next one is having to do with special education. I mentioned that special education is more than just providing accommodations to students. It really requires us or demands of us the changing or modifying of either the content for the student. In other words, the child is learning something different than what other students are learning. They might be in the same subject matter or the same class. It might all be language arts, but this student is doing something different than what the other students in the classroom are doing. Or we change the method by which a student is learning it. So let's say you have specific specialized reading programs. So maybe it's a multisensory reading approach to to learn how to read. So like Spire or Wilson or something like that. The method by which you're teaching that student differs. Or you need to change the delivery of the instruction. Something that comes to mind is what Amy Rowley's parents were requesting, the delivery of the instruction. They wanted an interpreter to deliver the instruction. So Amy would be able to, get the content from him or her. So again, it would be looking at changing the content, the delivery, or the methodology of instruction. That would be the definition of special education. Does it require that? And remember, it's a two-pronged approach. The child has the presence of a disability and needs specially designed instruction or special education. Okay. The next one, Selena, is related services. And related services, just the term related kind of helps you, meaning it's related to special ed. So while special ed supports what's happening in the regular classroom, related services supports what's happening in terms of special education. It's required in order for the child to benefit from special ed. It's it's those services like OT and PT, social work, SOP, orientation and mobility, which Amy might require, and so forth. That would help the special education be successful, and so forth. And so related services are required in order for the child to benefit from special education. And so we look at that kind of relationship between the two. I mentioned Jennifer had said something, and I said, oh gosh, this leads me into the next slide. This is called Say What. I know you believe you understand what you think I said, but I'm not sure you realize that what you heard is not what I meant. So I think that was my conversation with Jennifer. So sorry about that. I mentioned earlier that, miscommunication or lack of communication seems to be oftentimes at not the center necessarily, but involved in many of the cases that parents would file. And a lot of it's just they felt like they weren't being heard. Sometimes it was that you don't agree with me, and I'm going to go ahead and file. Other times it was I just want to be heard. And so oftentimes when I would sit and do like resolution sessions with parents and with school staff, to a lot of times administration, when the parent had a chance to just talk something through with the administrator, we were able to bring it to a close. We were able to resolve it before it got to further along in terms of the litigation process and so forth. And so I can't stress enough how important communication is. And I think it's just, be mindful of that when you are working with families, be mindful of that when you're working with one another, employ those kinds of techniques and strategies that we talked about yesterday morning, that those key phrases, those neutral statements, might help you in trying to either clarify from parents or rephrase what they said, and that way there's just kind of lesser chance of being either misconstrued or not heard at all. Okay, so what I'm going to do is going to just share with you some things that have been requested from parents. And you might look at this and say, well, that's pretty obvious to me. I mean, the parent wants their child to be evaluated, but not so fast. Okay, not so fast. That first one is really what I'm kind of referring to. A parent had asked that her child get tested, and if one might look at that, they might think, oh wow, that's pretty obvious. They want their child evaluated. But what ended up happening is that the school thought that they meant the regular education teacher thought that because the child was struggling in math, that the parent just wanted like a unit assessment or a end of chapter or an assessment done just in the area of math that she would basically administer to students in the classroom. And so that's what happened. The child was given this like a unit test in math, and that's not what the parent actually wanted. The parent wanted for the district to do a full psychoeducational evaluation of her child. And so something as simple as this phrase might lead us to think differently in terms of rather than what the parent had in mind to begin with. And so, use those techniques to question parents and just to get more information from them as to what it is that they're trying to accomplish, because again, it could be taken, in many different directions.
looking at the timeline for evaluations,
Yes.
and
The
we
60-day timeline or the timeline, the 15 school days for responding?
15
Or
days
both?
for responding.
Okay, okay,
15 days for responding.
okay,
It is my understanding, and I want to just make sure I'm clear. Parent says this in a parent-teacher conference,
okay,
some kind of phone call with somebody, and
okay,
says, I want my child tested. They're struggling. I think they need special education. So they
okay,
don't tell you what they think the child needs other than they think they need help with special education. That's all they say.
okay, perfect, yeah, okay,
They-
good
they-
example.
Okay, so we're just going to say this was on the 1st of the month, so we can look at dates easily.
Okay, okay,
We hear that on the 1st. We are required by the 15th.
by
That's a
15 school days, okay,
school day.
school
okay.
days, yes. So it may not be the 15th, it's probably gonna be later than that, because you're
Sure.
gonna take away the weekends, okay?
Or breaks. Does
Yep.
that include
Yeah.
breaks?
So the caveat, I don't have that same PowerPoint up, but the caveat in that is that if you are up against a break
Yes.
that is 14 days or longer, then you now have an extension on that. You now have, 30 days that go beyond that. So it basically, the New Mexico Administrative Code is, giving schools kind of an allowance because they realize that, all of a sudden you're faced with a break and people are, basically allowed to take that break and then come back and then obviously address that. So yes, if they're